A retired Navy SEAL had spent years avoiding German Shepherds and the memory of the loyal K9 he once sent into danger. Then, during a deadly ice storm, he found 2 freezing puppies curled beside their dead mother. He turned away, determined not to feel that pain again. But the smallest puppy crawled across the ice, rested her head on his boot, and refused to let him leave. He thought he was saving 2 abandoned lives. He had no idea they were about to save his. Before we begin, tell us what city you're watching from in the comments below, and please subscribe to the channel for more heartwarming stories of loyalty, healing, and second chances. Ice rain swept across the Ozark Mountains before dawn, sealing the roads near Jasper beneath glass and bending cedar trees until their branches cracked in the darkness. Mark Dawson stood in the mudroom of his isolated cabin, listening to the forest break apart. At 58, the retired Navy SEAL remained tall and broad-shouldered, with the lean, hardened build of a man who had spent most of his life carrying weapons, equipment, and responsibilities heavier than either. His iron-gray hair was cut close, his square jaw covered by a short silver beard, and his pale blue eyes held the guarded stillness of someone who noticed everything but volunteered nothing. Mark had no scars across his face, yet there was something wounded in the way he avoided people and ended conversations before kindness could become familiarity. The residents of Jasper considered him dependable but unreachable. He repaired fences for elderly neighbors, cleared fallen trees from mountain roads, and refused payment with the same cold politeness he used to refuse invitations. Solitude was not merely his preference. It was the punishment he had chosen for himself. Mark pulled on a heavy canvas coat, lifted a flashlight and hatchet from the wall, and opened the door. "One fence check," he muttered. "Then I'm done arguing with the mountain." The storm answered by throwing freezing rain against his face. He moved carefully down the slope toward the eastern property line, testing every step before placing his full weight on the ice. His left knee had become stiff with age, but his posture remained balanced and alert. Halfway down the trail, a cedar tree split somewhere ahead with a sound like a rifle shot. Mark stopped, waiting for the echo to fade. Then he heard something else, a thin, trembling cry, almost swallowed by the wind. His shoulders tightened. The sound came again from beyond a fallen cedar near the fence. Mark followed it through the broken branches, sweeping his flashlight across the snow until the beam found a young female German Shepherd lying beneath the tree. She was perhaps 3 years old, lean and long-legged with tawny fur beneath a black saddle and pointed ears crusted with ice. Her body had become rigid, but she remained curled around 2 puppies, protecting them even after the cold had taken her life. The larger puppy was a sable male about 4 weeks old, with oversized paws, a blunt muzzle, and dark markings spreading across his back and face. He trembled violently while pressing himself against his smaller sister. The female was cream white, with folded ears, a narrow little face, and pale fur soaked tightly against her ribs. She barely moved. Mark stared at their sharp ears and dark, intelligent eyes, and the storm disappeared around him. He was no longer in Arkansas. He was back inside a ruined compound overseas, kneeling behind a shattered wall with Rex beside him. Rex had been a 90-pound sable German Shepherd with a broad chest, a black mask, and deep brown eyes that watched Mark's hands more closely than most men watched a commanding officer. He had been steady under gunfire, gentle with injured soldiers, and stubbornly fond of carrying 2 tennis balls in his mouth at once. Rex had trusted Mark completely, and that trust was the reason Mark could no longer bear the breed. During their final operation, Mark had seen Rex hesitate outside a dark corridor. It had lasted less than a second, a slight pause most handlers would never have noticed. Mark had noticed, but men were trapped on the other side, and he had given the hand signal to move forward. Rex obeyed. The hidden explosive detonated before Mark could call him back. Rex died in Mark's arms while still watching him with the same unquestioning loyalty. Mark had spent years telling himself the order had saved 3 men. It never changed the fact that he had sent his closest partner into the darkness. Since then, every German shepherd's loyal eyes felt like an accusation. He did not truly hate them. He hated the man he remembered whenever he saw them. Mark stepped backward from the fallen tree. "No," he whispered. The sable puppy weakly lifted his head, then let it fall against his mother's frozen side. Mark tightened his grip on the hatchet. "Someone from town will come when the road opens." The words sounded practical, almost reasonable, and completely false. The road might remain blocked for days. Neither puppy had hours. Mark turned toward the cabin anyway. He had built his life around one rule: never love anything that could trust him enough to die for him. Behind him came a faint scraping sound. He stopped but did not turn immediately. "Stay where you are," he said. The scraping continued. When Mark finally looked back, the white puppy had crawled from beneath her mother's body. Her front paws clawed weakly against the ice while her hind legs dragged uselessly behind her. She did not bark or cry. She moved only a few inches at a time, resting whenever her small body failed her. Mark watched her approach with anger rising in his chest. Not anger toward the puppy, but toward the part of himself that still wanted to kneel. "You picked the wrong man," he told her. She continued until she reached his boot, rested her head against the frozen leather, and closed her eyes. The tiny weight against his foot broke through every defense he had spent years building. Mark remembered Rex leaning against that same boot during long nights overseas. He remembered the last command, the explosion, and the warm body growing still in his arms. He also understood that walking away now would not protect him from the past. It would only prove that the past had turned him into someone Rex would not have recognized. "Damn it," Mark breathed, dropping to his knees. He lifted the white puppy first and tucked her inside his coat against his chest. Then he gathered the sable male, who weakly pushed his muzzle toward his sister as though he still intended to protect her. "She's here," Mark said. "I've got both of you." Before leaving, he looked down at the dead mother. Her frozen body remained curved around the empty place where her puppies had lain. Mark bowed his head slightly. "You held the line long enough," he said. "I'll take it from here." The climb back to the cabin felt longer than the entire descent. Ice cracked beneath his boots, branches fell in the darkness, and the wind pressed against him as if the mountain wanted its victims returned. Mark locked one arm around the puppies and kept moving. "Stay awake," he ordered them. "You can make my life miserable after sunrise." The sable puppy gave a faint twitch inside his coat. The white one did not respond. Mark kicked the cabin door shut behind him, crossed quickly to the hearth, and laid both puppies on a folded wool blanket near the fire. The sable male continued to tremble, his small body fighting desperately to create warmth. The white puppy had stopped shaking entirely. Mark's stomach tightened. He touched 2 fingers to her chest, searching beneath the wet fur. For one terrible moment, he felt nothing. Then a heartbeat fluttered against his fingertips, so faint and uneven that it seemed to be slipping farther away with every breath. "No," Mark said, dropping beside her. "Not after you followed me home." The fire had begun to climb, but the white puppy remained frighteningly still on the wool blanket. Mark dropped beside her, pushed the wet fur away from her narrow chest, and felt again for the faint flutter beneath his fingertips. It was there, but barely. The sable male continued to shake beside her, his oversized paws scraping weakly against the blanket as he tried to press closer to his sister. "All right," Mark said, forcing his voice into the calm, controlled tone he had once used during battlefield emergencies. "We do this one problem at a time." He moved quickly through the cabin, closing the curtains to reduce drafts, adding 2 dry logs to the fire, and pulling an old metal first aid box from beneath the kitchen sink. He filled a bowl with warm water, soaked 2 clean towels, wrung them nearly dry, and wrapped one around each puppy. He knew rapid heating could be dangerous, so he kept them near the hearth rather than directly against it, rubbing their bodies slowly to restore circulation. The sable male protested with a thin squeak and tried to bite Mark's thumb with gums too weak to cause pain. The stubborn response brought the first trace of relief Mark had felt since finding them. "Still looking for a fight," he murmured. That's something. He searched the pantry and found a can of evaporated milk, then mixed a small amount with warm water. It was not proper puppy formula, and he knew it, but the storm had cut the cabin off from town. He drew the mixture into a clean plastic syringe without a needle and tested one drop against his wrist. The sable puppy turned toward the smell immediately. At first, he struggled against Mark's hand, but the moment a drop touched his tongue, hunger overcame suspicion. He swallowed, then began sucking greedily at the end of the syringe, his whole body leaning forward. "Slow down," Mark warned. "You survived the cold just to drown in breakfast, and I'll be offended." The puppy released a tiny, irritated growl. Mark studied the dark copper tones beneath his sable coat and the fierce determination in his young face. "Tucker," he decided. "You look like trouble that refuses to stay buried." Tucker drank several small portions before Mark placed him back on the blanket. The puppy immediately crawled toward his sister and rested his chin over her shoulder. The white female did not react when Mark lifted her. Her cream-colored fur had begun to dry, revealing how thin she was beneath it. Her ribs were visible, her folded ears looked too large for her small head, and her pale nose remained cold. Mark touched a drop of milk to her lip. Nothing happened. He rubbed gently beneath her jaw and tried again. Her tongue moved slightly, followed by one weak swallow. "That's it," he whispered. "Do it again." She managed only 2 more drops before her head rolled against his palm. Mark felt the memory of Rex rising inside him, but this time it did not arrive as a complete scene. It came in pieces, brown eyes losing focus, heavy fur beneath his hands, the silence after the final breath. His chest tightened. Every instinct told him to put the puppy down before hope became another weapon turned against him. He nearly obeyed. Then Tucker gave a weak cry from the blanket and tried to crawl after his sister. Mark looked from the small male to the fading white puppy in his hands. "You two don't know anything about leaving well enough alone," he said. He placed the female against his chest beneath his flannel shirt, then wrapped his old military blanket around himself and sat close to the hearth. Her body felt like a piece of ice laid over his heart. He cupped one hand around her back and used the other to support her head. "You need a name, too," he said after several silent minutes. Naming her felt dangerous. Names created attachment, and attachment created graves. Still, she had crossed frozen ground when she should not have possessed the strength to move. "Pearl," he said quietly, looking at the pale curve of her head. Small, stubborn, and found where no one expected anything valuable. Tucker remained on the blanket near Mark's boots, unable to climb into the chair but unwilling to settle farther away. Each time Pearl's breathing paused, Mark stopped breathing with her. Each time it resumed, he pressed his palm more firmly over her back. Hours passed. The fire burned down and was rebuilt twice. Mark fed Tucker small amounts every 40 minutes, then offered Pearl 1 drop at a time. Most ran from the corner of her mouth, but some she swallowed. Near 3 in the morning, she twitched beneath the blanket. Mark froze. One tiny paw flexed against his skin, followed by a shallow but clearer breath. "There you are," he whispered. Pearl's nose moved as though searching for something, then pressed against the warmth of his chest. Her heartbeat remained fast and fragile, but it no longer felt as though it were disappearing. Mark lowered his head and closed his eyes, allowing the relief to pass through him without naming what it meant. By dawn, the ice storm had buried the road beneath fallen branches. The telephone line still worked, though only after Mark struck the receiver twice with his palm. He called Evelyn Price, the nearest neighbor, because she had once been a nurse and because she was the only person within 2 miles stubborn enough to answer before sunrise. Evelyn was 72, tall and slender, despite a careful limp left by an old hip injury. She had warm brown skin, short silver hair she cut herself, and sharp dark eyes that made dishonesty difficult. Years of emergency room work had given her a practical manner, while losing her husband had made her gentler with lonely people and less patient with their excuses. "You never call unless a tree is on fire or you are bleeding," she said when she answered. "Which is it?" Mark explained the puppies as briefly as possible. Evelyn listened, asked about their breathing, gum color, body temperature, and ability to swallow, then instructed him to continue gradual warming and tiny feedings. She contacted a rescue center in Harrison, but the staff could not reach the mountain until the road reopened. "So they stay with you?" she said. "Temporarily," Mark replied. Evelyn paused long enough for him to hear her disbelief. By mid-morning, Tucker could hold up his head and crawl several feet before collapsing into sleep. Pearl remained weaker, but whenever Mark moved across the cabin, she opened her eyes and tried to follow the sound of his boots. He constructed a low bed from a laundry basket lined with towels, yet Pearl repeatedly dragged herself toward him until he placed the basket beside his chair. Tucker positioned himself along the outer edge, his small, sable body between his sister and the room. When a branch struck the roof, Tucker lifted his head and gave a breathless growl, guarding Pearl from a threat he could not understand. Mark watched them from the chair, telling himself the arrangement would end when the road opened. But when Pearl rested her chin over the edge of the basket and fixed her tired eyes on him, he moved one boot closer so she could touch it with her paw. 3 months softened the Ozark winter into a wet, restless spring, and Mark Dawson's cabin changed from a place of disciplined silence into a territory ruled by muddy paws, stolen socks, and arguments conducted mostly through barking. Tucker had grown into a sturdy 4-month-old sable German shepherd with a broadening chest, oversized feet, and dark markings that sharpened the bold expression on his face. He approached the world as though every chair leg, broom, and falling leaf had challenged his authority. Pearl remained smaller and more delicate, her cream-white coat thickening around her neck and shoulders, her narrow face becoming graceful rather than fragile. She moved quietly, watched everything, and seemed able to recognize changes in Mark before he did. Whenever his left knee stiffened, she walked against that side of his body. When a nightmare pulled him awake, she appeared beside the bed without barking, resting her chin on the mattress until his breathing slowed. Mark insisted these behaviors meant nothing. He said it while replacing a strip of baseboard Tucker had chewed, while lifting Pearl off a pile of freshly folded towels, and while checking both puppies twice before locking the cabin each night. He had established a schedule within days of the road reopening. Feeding at 6, outdoor exercise at 6:30, training at 7. Tucker learned quickly when the lesson involved movement. He could come, heel, and retrieve with enthusiastic precision, but staying still seemed personally offensive to him. Pearl studied Mark's hands before listening to his voice. She learned the raised fist for stop, 2 fingers lowered for down, and the flat palm that meant wait. Sometimes she responded before he completed the signal, and each time she did, Mark felt an uncomfortable echo of Rex. "Don't get proud," he told her one morning after she held a perfect stay while Tucker chased a beetle through the grass. Pearl tilted her head. Tucker returned with dirt across his nose and no beetle. "And you," Mark said, "are a tactical embarrassment." Tucker wagged as if he had received a medal. Despite the humor that had begun slipping back into his voice, Mark kept one room closed and one part of himself guarded. A small cedar box remained inside the bottom drawer of the sideboard. It held his Navy identification tags, Rex's worn leather collar, and the folded cloth patch Mark had removed from his uniform after the final mission. He had not opened the box in years. He had also never thrown it away. The trouble began on an afternoon when rain pressed against the windows and mist erased the trees beyond the porch. Mark left the puppies inside while he repaired a loose section of gutter at the back of the cabin. He expected to be gone 10 minutes. The rusted bracket fought him long enough to turn 10 minutes into nearly half an hour. When he returned, the cabin was silent. Mark paused with one hand on the door. Silence had once been what he wanted most. Living with 2 young German shepherds had taught him that silence usually meant someone had committed a crime and was waiting to see whether the evidence could be eaten. He stepped inside. Pearl sat near the fireplace with one of Mark's old shirts beneath her front paws, her ears lowered in uncertainty. Tucker stood beside the open sideboard drawer. The cedar box lay overturned on the floor. Rex's collar had been dragged halfway beneath the table, and Mark's metal tags hung from Tucker's mouth. One tag bore 2 fresh dents where the puppy had bitten down. "Drop it," Mark said. His voice was quiet enough to stop both dogs instantly. Tucker opened his mouth, and the tags struck the floor with a small metallic click. The sound became something else inside Mark's head, a radio snapping with static, boots striking concrete, the sharp command he had given Rex before the dog entered the corridor. His vision narrowed. The cabin's warm wooden walls dissolved into smoke and broken stone. Mark saw Rex hesitate again. He saw his own hand rise. Forward. The command had taken less than a second. The consequence had lasted for years. "No," Mark whispered. Tucker took one uncertain step toward him. His tail moved once, cautiously. Mark bent and snatched the tags from the floor. The new tooth mark crossed part of his name. It was harmless, but grief did not care about proportion. "What did you do?" His voice rose. Tucker lowered his head. Pearl moved toward her brother and stood close enough for their shoulders to touch. That small act of loyalty should have softened Mark. Instead, it made Rex's final obedience feel even closer. "You destroy everything you touch," he snapped. Pearl flinched. Tucker remained still, looking at him with confused dark eyes. Mark pointed toward the back door. "Out!" Neither puppy moved. "I said out!" He opened the door and guided Tucker onto the porch more roughly than necessary. Pearl followed without being touched, unwilling to leave her brother alone. Rain swept across the yard as they ran toward the woodshed. Mark shut the door and turned the lock. "Tomorrow," he said to the empty room, breathing hard. "Tomorrow the rescue center takes both of you." Evening settled over the mountain, and the rain grew heavier. Mark cleaned the metal tags, placed Rex's collar back in the cedar box, and tried to recover the silence he had once considered safety. It no longer felt safe. It felt enormous. There was no scratching at the kitchen door, no thump of Tucker dropping a stolen boot, no soft movement of Pearl settling beside his chair. Mark told himself the puppies were dry in the woodshed. There was straw inside, a raised floor, and protection from the wind. He lasted until the first close roll of thunder shook the windows. Pearl feared thunder. She tried to hide it by lowering her body and staying close to Tucker, but Mark had noticed. "They're fine," he said aloud. Another flash turned the window white. Mark crossed the room and pulled aside the curtain. The woodshed door stood open, but the shelter was empty. His pulse sharpened. Then lightning revealed 2 shapes sitting only a few feet from the cabin. Tucker faced the tree line, rain streaming from his sable coat, his young body rigid as he watched the darkness. Pearl sat beneath the window, soaked and trembling, but her eyes remained fixed on Mark. They had not run away. They had taken positions around the cabin and continued guarding the man who had rejected them. Mark placed one hand against the glass. Pearl rose, stepped closer, and lifted a muddy paw to the same spot on the other side. For several seconds, Mark could not move. Rex's loyalty had become a wound because Mark had remembered only the moment it ended. Looking at Pearl and Tucker, he understood that loyalty was not an accusation. It was a gift freely offered, even to someone frightened enough to mishandle it. Mark unlocked the door and pulled it open. "Inside," he said, but his voice broke. Tucker entered first, then turned immediately to make sure Pearl followed. Mark knelt in the water and mud they carried across the floor. Pearl pressed against his chest. Tucker leaned his wet head beneath Mark's hand. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered. "Neither of you deserved that." He dried them beside the fire and left the cedar box open on the table, no longer hidden in the drawer. The following morning, the telephone rang. A staff member from the rescue center explained that 2 approved families were ready to adopt the puppies. One wanted Tucker, and another had chosen Pearl. They could be collected the next day, but they would not remain together. Mark looked across the cabin. Tucker slept with one paw resting over Pearl's back, while Pearl's nose was tucked beneath his chin. Morning arrived cold and gray, with rainwater sliding from the cabin roof and low clouds hanging over the Ozark ridges. Mark Dawson stood beside his old truck while Tucker and Pearl circled his boots, unaware that the day had been arranged to end without them. He had barely slept after the call from the rescue center. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Tucker's paw resting across Pearl's back and heard the staff member explain that the puppies had been selected by 2 different adopters. Mark told himself separation was not cruelty. Good homes were difficult to find, and 2 growing German Shepherds required more money, space, and patience than 1. He was 58, lived alone on a mountain, and still woke some mornings with his left knee locked stiff. Practical men did not confuse affection with responsibility. Yet when he opened the truck's rear door, Tucker jumped inside and immediately turned to wait for Pearl. She climbed in more carefully, then settled against his side. Mark closed the door and stood with his hand on the metal longer than necessary. "This is the right thing," he said. Tucker pressed his nose to the window. Pearl watched Mark with the same quiet trust that had followed him since the ice storm. The Jasper Mountain Animal Rescue occupied a renovated red-brick veterinary building at the edge of town. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant, dog food, and wet fur. The rescue coordinator, Sarah Whitmore, met Mark near the reception desk. Sarah was 46, tall and narrow-shouldered, with freckled fair skin, dark auburn hair twisted into a loose knot, and green eyes made sharper by years of noticing fear before animals could express it. A bite scar crossed the back of one hand from a frightened dog she had rescued after a tornado, but the experience had made her more patient rather than cautious. She spoke gently to animals and directly to people, especially those who disguised fear as logic. "They look healthy," she said as Tucker leaned against Mark's leg and Pearl remained close to his other boot. "You did more than keep them alive." Mark handed her the leashes. They were difficult to kill. Sarah studied him for a moment, but did not challenge the answer. The family waiting for Tucker sat in a bright meeting room nearby. Daniel Foster was a broad, clean-shaven man of 39 with sandy hair, sun-reddened skin, and the confident posture of someone accustomed to managing a construction crew. His wife, Megan, was 37, medium height, with straight brown hair, a soft round face, and a careful way of speaking that suggested she preferred decisions made after discussion rather than impulse. Their 11-year-old son, Noah, was thin, brown-eyed, and almost painfully excited. Tucker's size and boldness had attracted them because Daniel wanted a dog who could accompany the family on hikes and eventually guard their rural property. Pearl's adopter waited in the opposite room. Helen Moore was 68, short and softly built, with silver curls, pale skin, and light blue eyes that warmed whenever Pearl looked toward her. She had taught elementary school for 35 years and lived alone after her older sister died. Helen wanted a calm companion and believed Pearl's gentle nature would suit her quiet home. Both choices appeared sensible. That was what Mark hated most. There was no villain to fight, no careless owner to reject, no obvious reason to stop the process. Daniel knelt and offered Tucker a closed hand to smell. Tucker sniffed him, then looked back at Mark. Noah laughed when the puppy's tail struck the chair. Across the hall, Helen sat on the floor rather than forcing Pearl to approach. Pearl eventually took one step toward her, but her eyes remained fixed on Tucker. Sarah brought out the adoption documents and placed them on a desk. "You can say goodbye before we move them," she told Mark. "They'll both be cared for." Mark nodded, though his chest felt tighter than it had during the drive. He crouched between the puppies and ran one hand over Tucker's broadening head, then touched the soft fur beneath Pearl's chin. "Behave yourselves," he said. Tucker licked his wrist. Pearl pressed her forehead against his knee. Mark stood quickly before the gesture could change anything. Sarah handed Tucker's leash to Daniel and guided Pearl toward Helen. For 3 steps, both puppies moved reluctantly. Then they realized they were being led in opposite directions. Tucker stopped so abruptly that Daniel nearly lost his balance. The sable puppy twisted toward Pearl, gave one sharp bark, and pulled hard enough to drag the leash through Daniel's hand. Pearl flattened herself against the floor. Helen spoke softly and loosened the lead, but Pearl would not rise. Her cream-white body trembled as Tucker scrambled across the tile toward her. A staff member reached for him, and Tucker ducked beneath the arm, sliding on the polished floor until he reached his sister. He stood over Pearl with his legs braced, barking at anyone who approached. Pearl pushed herself beneath his chest and pressed her face against his front leg. "They'll adjust," Daniel said, though his earlier confidence had faded. Sarah did not answer immediately. She watched the puppies, then looked at Mark. "Possibly," she said, "but they are more strongly bonded than we understood." Mark remained near the wall, every instinct urging him to leave before the decision became his again. He remembered their mother curled around them beneath the cedar. Tucker had tried to warm Pearl when he could barely keep himself alive. Pearl had followed Mark through the ice because leaving Tucker behind had never entered her mind. Since then, each had become the other's first point of safety. Separating them might provide two good homes, but it would begin both lives with another loss. Mark walked forward and lowered himself between them. Tucker's barking stopped immediately. Pearl rose and pushed against Mark's side while Tucker leaned against the other. Their breathing slowed as soon as they touched him. The three of them formed the same small circle they had made beside the fire on their first night. Sarah placed the unsigned papers in front of Mark. "There is another option," she said. He looked at the costs listed on the adoption forms, then thought of his leaking shed roof, aging truck, and narrow retirement income. He also thought of the cabin without Pearl's quiet footsteps or Tucker's daily war against furniture. The imagined silence felt colder than the ice storm. "Cancel both placements," Mark said. Daniel looked disappointed, but Megan placed a hand on her son's shoulder and nodded with understanding. Helen smiled sadly at Pearl. "She already chose," she said. Mark signed the adoption papers for both puppies before he could retreat behind another excuse. When Sarah handed him the completed documents, his name appeared beside Tucker's and Pearl's under the same address. For the first time, Mark did not call the arrangement temporary. On the drive home, Tucker occupied most of the rear seat while Pearl slept with her head across his back. Mark checked the mirror more often than the road required. During the following days, he repaired the eastern fence, built 2 raised sleeping platforms near the hearth, ordered larger food bowls, and cleared a permanent area for training behind the cabin. He moved Rex's cedar box onto the mantel rather than returning it to the drawer. Tucker followed him from task to task, carrying pieces of scrapwood that had not been requested. Pearl stayed close whenever Mark climbed a ladder, watching each movement with quiet concern. By the end of the week, the cabin no longer contained anything temporary. Their names were written on veterinary forms, their collars hung beside the door, and 2 growing beds occupied the warmest corner of the room. Several mornings later, Mark entered the storage shed to move a 50-pound bag of dog food away from a leaking seam in the roof. The storm had left the floor damp, and the sack had begun to soften along one edge. He bent, gripped it beneath the middle, and lifted while twisting toward a dry pallet. Pain exploded through his lower back before he could straighten. His hands opened. The bag struck the floor and split, scattering dry food across the boards. Mark dropped to one knee, then both, unable to draw a full breath. Tucker rushed through the doorway, followed closely by Pearl. Mark planted one hand against the wall and tried to stand, but a second spasm drove through his spine and down his right leg. He collapsed beside the torn sack, realizing with sudden clarity that he could not reach the cabin, the telephone, or even the open shed door without help. Pain held Mark Dawson against the shed floor with the force of a steel trap. Every attempt to move sent a white-hot spasm through his lower back and down his right leg, leaving him breathless beside the torn bag of dog food. Tucker reached him first, skidding through the scattered kibble before forcing his broad, sable head beneath Mark's shoulder. At 7 months old, the young German Shepherd had grown powerful through the chest, but he was still too small to lift a full-grown man. He pushed anyway, whining with frustration each time Mark failed to rise. "Easy," Mark gasped. "You're going to break your neck trying to fix mine." Tucker ignored him and pushed again. Pearl stood a few feet away, her cream-white body rigid and her dark eyes fixed on Mark's face. Unlike her brother, she did not rush blindly into the problem. She watched his hands, his breathing, and the way his right leg refused to support him. Mark dragged himself toward the door, but another spasm folded him over. The cabin telephone sat less than 60 yards away, yet the distance might as well have been another mountain. His mouth had already gone dry, and the damp shed air felt heavy in his lungs. "Phone," he muttered, pointing toward the cabin even though neither dog could understand the full meaning. Tucker moved to the doorway and stretched across it, his body facing outward while his head remained turned toward Mark. He had taken position as if guarding an injured member of his team. Pearl continued to study the scene. Then she turned and ran. Mark watched her disappear across the yard. For one bitter second he believed she had panicked and fled. The thought hurt more than it should have. "Can't blame her," he whispered. Tucker gave a low growl toward the trees, as though rejecting the idea. Pearl did not go to the cabin. She crossed the eastern trail, slipped beneath the repaired fence, and followed the narrow path through the woods toward Evelyn Price's house. The route was more than a mile and filled with roots, wet stones, and shallow gullies left by spring rain. Pearl had never traveled it alone, but she had followed Mark there twice during training walks and remembered every turn. Evelyn was sorting medicine bottles at her kitchen table when scratching erupted at the back door. She opened it to find Pearl panting hard, her white coat streaked with mud and her ears flattened with urgency. "Where is Mark?" Evelyn asked. Pearl barked once, spun toward the trail, then returned to paw at Evelyn's boot. The retired nurse understood distress when she saw it. She was 72, but years in emergency rooms had trained her to move quickly without wasting motion. Her tall, slender frame had become slightly stooped, and the old injury in her hip made her limp more sharply in damp weather. Yet determination straightened her whenever someone needed help. She grabbed her keys, a first aid bag, and her phone. Pearl ran beside Evelyn's aging station wagon, stopping only when the vehicle fell behind on the rough trail. By the time Evelyn reached the cabin, Tucker's barking had become hoarse. Pearl led her directly to the shed. Mark was pale, sweating, and barely able to sit upright. "You look terrible," Evelyn said, kneeling beside him. "I've looked worse. Not while conscious." She checked his pulse, tested the feeling in his feet, and called the county ambulance. Mark tried to refuse. Evelyn leaned close, her dark eyes leaving no room for negotiation. "You adopted 2 dogs because you finally admitted you needed a family. Families are allowed to call for help." The ambulance crew reached the property using a 4-wheel drive vehicle. Tucker had to be restrained while they lifted Mark onto the stretcher, not because he attacked, but because he repeatedly tried to place himself between Mark and the strangers. Pearl followed the stretcher to the vehicle and attempted to climb inside. "They stay with me," Evelyn promised. Mark looked at both dogs, frightened by how much leaving them affected him. "Keep them together." At the hospital in Harrison, tests showed severe muscle spasms caused by an old spinal injury, worsened by dehydration and the twisting lift. Mark avoided surgery, but the doctor ordered several days of observation, medication, and strict rest. Evelyn cared for Tucker and Pearl at her home. Tucker spent most of each day beside the front door, rising whenever tires sounded on the road. Pearl slept on Mark's old field jacket, which Evelyn had brought from the cabin. Both dogs ate only when she sat beside them and placed their bowls close together. On the 4th morning, Evelyn drove Mark home. He moved slowly with a cane, angered by his body's betrayal and embarrassed by the effort required to climb his own steps. Tucker burst through the door, then stopped just before colliding with him. The young dog pressed his head gently against Mark's thigh instead. Pearl approached more carefully, sniffed the hospital scent on his clothing, and walked beside him all the way to the bedroom. Tucker settled across the doorway, watching the hall. Pearl climbed onto the mattress and lay against Mark's chest, directly over the place where he had warmed her during the ice storm. Mark rested one hand along her back. "I thought I brought you home to save you," he said. Tucker's tail struck the floor once. Pearl's breathing remained slow and steady beneath his palm. For the first time, Mark understood that rescue was not a debt paid in one direction. Recovery forced him to accept limitations he had spent years denying. He shortened his chores, used lighter feed containers, and allowed Evelyn to check on him without pretending the visits were unnecessary. As summer faded, he resumed training Tucker and Pearl along the wooded trails. Tucker learned to return instantly on a whistle and position himself between Mark and unfamiliar movement. Pearl became skilled at scent work, locating hidden gloves, dropped tools, and even Evelyn's keys after she deliberately placed them beneath fallen leaves. Mark's body remained imperfect, but the dogs gave him a reason to rebuild it carefully instead of punishing it. By early autumn, hunting season brought distant rifle fire to the surrounding ridges. Tucker responded with alert curiosity, but Pearl lowered her body at every shot. Mark worked patiently, rewarding her whenever she remained beside him. One afternoon, gray clouds gathered while the three followed the old boundary trail. A rifle cracked from somewhere just beyond Mark's property, close enough to shake leaves from the branches. Tucker spun toward the sound. Pearl froze, eyes wide and breath trapped in her chest. "Pearl, stay!" Mark commanded, reaching for her collar. A second illegal shot exploded through the trees. Fear overcame every lesson she had learned. Pearl twisted from his grasp and vanished into the darkening forest before Mark could reach her. Rain began to fall within minutes of Pearl disappearing, thin at first, then hard enough to blur the trees and turn the old boundary trail into a dark ribbon of mud. Mark stood where she had vanished, one hand gripping Tucker's collar while the other pressed against the ache gathering in his lower back. The second rifle shot had gone silent, but its echo still seemed trapped between the ridges. "Find Pearl," he told Tucker. "Take me to her." The 7-month-old sable German shepherd lowered his broad head to the wet leaves, circling the place where his sister's scent had broken away from the trail. His large paws dug into the mud, and his dark muzzle moved rapidly as he separated Pearl's trail from the smells of rain, deer, and rotting wood. Then he pulled sharply toward the eastern slope. Mark followed, using a fallen branch as a walking stick whenever the ground became steep. Pearl's pale paw prints appeared briefly in soft mud, then vanished beneath the increasing rain. Tucker never stopped. He moved with an urgency different from his usual reckless confidence, pausing at each fork until he found the scent again. "Easy," Mark said, as pain tightened along his spine. "Fast won't help her if I fall before we get there." Tucker glanced back, waited long enough for Mark to close the distance, then continued. The trail descended toward a narrow ravine, more than half a mile from the cabin. Mark recognized the area immediately. An old logging path crossed the ridge above it, abandoned years earlier after flooding washed out part of the slope. He pulled his phone from his coat and called Evelyn. His signal broke twice before the call connected. "Pearl ran after a gunshot," he said. "Tucker has her trail near the East Ravine." Evelyn did not waste time asking whether he was certain. She told him to remain where he was until she arrived, then ended the call. Mark continued moving. "She'll forgive me," he muttered. "Eventually." Tucker suddenly stopped at the edge of the ravine. His ears rose, and a low whine escaped him. From somewhere below came a weak bark. Mark stepped closer and looked down through the rain. A swollen creek twisted between black rocks at the bottom, its current fed by runoff from the surrounding hills. On a gravel shelf near the opposite bank, something white moved. "Pearl!" Mark shouted. Her head lifted. She was standing chest deep in the water, her cream-white coat plastered against her narrow body. One front leg was trapped beneath the surface, forcing her to lean sideways against the current. Each time she tried to pull free, her body slipped farther downstream. Tucker barked and attempted to descend, but Mark caught him before he could leap over the edge. "Not yet. We do this together." Evelyn arrived less than 15 minutes later, carrying a waterproof lantern, 2 wool blankets, and a coil of thick rope from her late husband's tool shed. Her short silver hair was hidden beneath a green rain hood, and her slender frame leaned heavily on the stronger leg whenever the muddy ground shifted beneath her. At 72, her old hip injury limited her speed, but not her determination. "You look like you're planning something stupid," she said, breathing hard. Mark took the rope. Then you arrived just in time. Evelyn studied the slope, the current, and Pearl's position. "Tie yourself twice. Your back won't survive a fall." Mark secured the rope around his waist while Evelyn looped the other end around a cedar trunk. Tucker paced along the edge, whining toward Pearl. "Stay with Evelyn," Mark ordered. He began descending slowly, digging his boots into the mud and using exposed roots as handholds. Halfway down, the slope gave way beneath his right foot. The rope tightened, stopping him before he struck the rocks. Pain flashed through his back, but he forced himself upright and reached the creek. The water rose above his knees immediately, cold enough to steal his breath. Pearl tried to move toward him and cried out when her trapped leg twisted. "Don't fight it," Mark said. "I'm here now." Beneath the water, his hands found an old steel foothold trap chained around a submerged root. Rust covered the jaws, but the springs still held with brutal strength. Mark braced his feet and pressed down with both hands. The trap shifted, but did not open. The current struck his injured side, making his legs buckle. Tucker broke from Evelyn's grasp and scrambled down the lower part of the ravine despite her shout. He entered the shallow edge of the creek, planted his wide paws between two rocks, and pressed his shoulder against Mark's thigh. The young dog trembled in the cold, but he held his position. "Good boy," Mark gasped. "Stay there." Evelyn leaned backward against the rope above them, keeping it tight around the cedar. Mark pushed again. The rusted springs moved a fraction. Pearl whimpered, her eyes fixed on him. For one terrible moment, Mark remembered Rex trapped beyond the reach of his command. He forced the memory away. Pearl was alive. This time, he still had time. "No one gets left behind," he said through clenched teeth. He pressed with everything he had. The jaws opened enough for Pearl's paw to slip free. She collapsed against his chest as the creek surged around them. Mark wrapped one arm beneath her body, but his footing gave way. Tucker caught the sleeve of his coat between his teeth while Evelyn hauled the rope from above. For several seconds, all three were dragged sideways through the current. Mark struck a rock with his knee. Tucker lost one paw hold, and Pearl's head dipped beneath the water. Mark pulled her higher and fought toward the bank. Tucker backed up one step at a time, gripping the coat until they reached the gravel shelf. Evelyn kept the rope tight as Mark climbed the slope with Pearl held against him and Tucker close behind. Pearl was taken to a veterinary clinic in Jasper, where Dr. Rachel Bennett treated her. Rachel was 43, medium height, with olive-toned skin, straight black hair cut to her shoulders, and calm gray eyes behind narrow glasses. Years of treating injured farm animals had given her steady hands and a direct manner softened by genuine affection for frightened creatures. She cleaned the deep bruising around Pearl's paw, treated the damaged tissue, and warmed her slowly beneath heated blankets. "She'll live," Rachel said several hours later, but the joint was compressed for too long. She may always favor that leg. Mark remained beside the examination table through the night. Tucker lay beneath it, his sable body curled around the metal base, refusing food unless Pearl opened her eyes. Near sunrise, Rachel removed part of the support wrap and encouraged Pearl to rise. The white dog trembled, placed 3 paws beneath herself, and hesitated over the injured leg. Mark crouched several feet away, one hand resting on the floor. Pearl looked at him, shifted her weight forward, and took her first unsteady steps toward his waiting boots. Winter returned to the Ozark Mountains beneath a softer sky, covering the ridges near Jasper with clean white snow instead of the hard glass of the previous year's ice storm. Pearl had recovered better than Dr. Rachel Bennett had expected. The cream-white German shepherd was nearly grown now, graceful through the shoulders and chest, with alert brown eyes and a pale coat that made her almost disappear against the snow. Her injured front leg remained slightly stiff on bitter mornings, and after long walks she sometimes favored it for several steps. But the limp no longer prevented her from running beside Tucker. Tucker had grown into a powerful sable male with a broad chest, dark muzzle, and thick fur along his neck. He slept near the front door every night, listened whenever tires approached the property, and inspected the tree line each morning as though the mountain had personally assigned him responsibility for its borders. Pearl preferred Mark's side. Whenever his lower back tightened, she slowed her pace without being commanded and pressed her shoulder against his leg. When old memories dragged him awake before dawn, she settled beside the bed until he recognized the cabin around him. Mark no longer pretended these things meant nothing. He had learned that denying love did not make it smaller. It only made a man lonelier while carrying it. The cedar box that once remained hidden in the sideboard now rested open on the fireplace mantel. Mark placed Rex's photograph upright behind it, facing the room instead of the wall. In the picture, the large sable German shepherd stood beside a younger Mark, his black mask lifted proudly and his deep brown eyes fixed on his handler. Mark's military identification tags lay beside the photograph, still bearing the shallow marks Tucker's puppy teeth had left in the metal. Next to them rested the first collars Tucker and Pearl had worn, one dark brown and one faded blue, both far too small for the dogs they had become. Mark had once believed loving them would replace Rex, as if affection were a limited supply that could belong only to the living or the dead. He understood differently now. Tucker's courage did not erase Rex's courage. Pearl's trust did not diminish the trust Rex had given him. Caring for them allowed the best part of Rex to continue through the hands that trained them and the home that protected them. One morning, Mark stood before the mantel while Tucker leaned against his boot and Pearl watched from beside the hearth. "You brought them to me somehow," Mark said to the photograph. He did not expect an answer. For once, he did not need one. Sarah Whitmore had called several weeks after Pearl's accident to ask whether Mark would help with a German shepherd that had stopped responding to the shelter staff. Mark initially refused. He had no interest in becoming a public example of healing, and he disliked the way people sometimes turned pain into a speech before it had become wisdom. Evelyn Price listened to his refusal from across the kitchen table, her silver eyebrows raised and her dark eyes unimpressed. "No one asked you to give a speech," she said. "They asked you to sit beside a frightened dog." The following morning, Mark drove to the Jasper Mountain Animal Rescue with Tucker and Pearl in the back seat. The shelter dog was a thin, black and tan female that hid at the rear of her kennel and growled whenever anyone reached toward her. Mark did not reach. He sat outside the gate with his back against the wall while Tucker lay calmly at his feet and Pearl rested nearby. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Then the frightened dog crawled forward and placed one paw near the bars. Mark returned the next day and the next. By the end of the second week, she accepted food from his hand. Sarah watched from the hallway without interrupting. Mark recognized the look in her green eyes. "Don't make this into something," he warned. "Too late," she said. His visits gradually became part of the shelter's weekly routine. Mark used the same patience, hand signals, and controlled movements he had once used with military dogs, but he no longer trained animals only to obey. He taught them that human hands could be predictable and safe. Evelyn helped organize transportation for older veterans living outside Jasper, while Sarah contacted local rescue groups and veterans organizations. The small effort eventually became a program called Rex's Second Watch. It matched abandoned dogs with former service members who lived alone and were willing to complete several weeks of training. Tucker and Pearl became the first demonstration dogs. Tucker showed nervous dogs how to move confidently through unfamiliar spaces, while Pearl approached frightened people with the same quiet sensitivity she had always shown Mark. Not every match succeeded, and Mark refused to pretend love could solve every difficulty. Some dogs needed more time. Some veterans were not ready, but enough of them found one another that the program continued growing. The cabin changed with it. Once visitors had rarely crossed Mark's porch. Now elderly veterans arrived for training sessions. Neighbors brought food, and Sarah occasionally left paperwork on his table while pretending she had stopped only for coffee. Evelyn came most often, usually carrying warm bread and complaining that Mark's idea of a proper meal remained an insult to agriculture. Tucker greeted visitors at the steps, cautious but controlled. Pearl moved quietly among them, often choosing the person who spoke least. Mark began noticing laughter in rooms that had once held only the ticking of a clock. He repaired a second bench for the porch, added hooks near the door for extra leashes, and cleared a portion of the barn for winter training. None of those changes felt like surrender. They felt like preparation for a life he had finally decided to remain inside. On a late afternoon, snow drifted slowly over the clearing while warm light shone through the cabin windows. Mark sat on the porch beside Evelyn, who wore a thick red scarf over her short silver hair and held a steaming mug between both hands. Tucker lay across Mark's boots, his sable body positioned toward the steps even while resting. Pearl sat close on the other side and placed her white head on Mark's knee. Evelyn looked through the window at the extra chairs around the table. "You may need a larger cabin," she said. Mark rubbed Pearl's ear. "Absolutely not." Tucker released a heavy sigh that sounded suspiciously like disagreement. Evelyn laughed, and after a moment, Mark joined her. He watched the snow settle across the same mountains that had once seemed determined to bury every living thing. The cold had not disappeared. His memories had not disappeared either, but the cabin behind him held light, food, voices, and space prepared for people who might need it. Tucker's weight warmed his boots, and Pearl's breathing remained steady beneath his hand. After years spent hiding from the past, Mark finally understood that surviving was not the same as living. Winter had returned, but it had returned to a home, and no one inside it would face the cold alone. Sometimes God's miracles do not arrive through thunder, wealth, or sudden answers. Sometimes they come quietly, on tired paws, through a loyal heart, or in the courage to open a door locked against love. Mark believed he was saving Tucker and Pearl, but grace had prepared them to save him in return. In life we may carry grief, regret, or loneliness that no one can see. Yet God can place hope in moments. A hand reaching out, an animal refusing to leave, a stranger choosing kindness, or a beginning we never expected. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and whether an animal has changed your life. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, healing, and second chances. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort your heart, and guide your path always.